Hi, I'm Tim, guitar player, teacher. In the last video, we introduced the concept of chords and built the formulas for our 4 triads. While making that video, I realized I left something out that should have been included: chord symbols. I briefly discussed how chords are named, but should have gone a little further and included the symbols that are used as shorthand for each of the chord values. So we'll start there. When labeling the value of a chord, there are a few options. The first is to use the entire name of the chord. However, it would get fairly difficult to read if the sheet was filled with chord names written out that way. It would also become impossible in some situations to get the names of the chords lined up properly with the beat they occur on if we had to leave room for long chord names. This is not a very reasonable or practical option. A better option would be to use an abbreviation for the value of the chord. These are often just the first 3 letters of the chord's value: M-A-J for major, M-I-N for minor, A-U-G for augmented, and D-I-M for diminished. Sometimes these abbreviations are even shortened to just the first letter of the chord's value, although this is only commonly done with a capital M to signify major and a lowercase m to signify minor. The next option is to use any one of a group of symbols. These vary greatly depending on the preference of the writer, but most of them are fairly obvious. As a general rule, the word major tends to mean that we are being diatonic, or simply that nothing has been changed. For this reason, major can be thought of as the default chord value. So when we are naming a major chord, we don't actually need to indicate the word major. Therefore, there is no alternate symbol for a major chord. The root of the chord completely by itself indicates a major triad. For minor chords, a minus sign or a dash is often used as an alternate symbol. For augmented chords, the most common symbol is a plus sign. Occasionally, the plus sign is used to denote another chord tone being raised, like a sharp 9 for example, but a vast majority of the time a plus sign means to raise the 5th of the chord. I've also seen sharp 5 being added to the chord's name to indicate an augmented triad, basically telling you it's a major chord with a raised 5th. For diminished chords, the most common symbol is a small circle. These symbols and abbreviations are the most common way for chord values to be noted on any chart, score, lead sheet, or most modern sheet music. As the chord values get more complicated, more symbols will be added, but a vast majority of them are very intuitive. As we get into more complicated chords, we will be looking at more of these other symbols. At the end of the last video, I mentioned that we would be covering 7th chords next. However, I changed my mind and decided to look at chord inversions instead. I think covering this now with simple triads will make it much easier to grasp when we do move on to more complicated chords. Remembering from our interval lessons, the inversion of an interval is basically just rearranging the notes of the interval. For chord inversions, we're going to do the same thing. When building a chord, the notes of the chord do not necessarily need to be in the order of the chord's formula. In fact, they can be in whatever order we choose, with any or all of the notes being repeated as many times as we choose. When we do rearrange them, we are creating different inversions of the chord. The note that matters when naming these inversions is the bass note, or the lowest pitched note of the chord. If the root of the chord is the bass note, the chord is said to be in root position. If the third of the chord is the bass note, we are playing what is called the first inversion of the chord. If the 5th of the chord is the bass note, we are playing what is called the second inversion of the chord. Other than the bass note, we can do whatever we want with the other notes. The way we choose to arrange the other notes of the chord is called the chord's voicing, and each note of the chord is called a voice. Chord voicings are often very dependent on a combination of things: the bass line, the melody, the number and type of instruments or voices available, timbre, dynamics, etc. When all of the notes of a chord are within 1 octave, it is called a close voicing. If the notes of the chord extend beyond an octave, it is called an open voicing. Whether the voicing is close or open has no bearing on the name of the inversion, but for the sake of this lesson, we are going to be looking only at close voicings. The most typical way to start building inversions starts with a close voicing of the root position chord. This means the chord will be made up of the root, the third, and the fifth, in that order, all in the same octave. We will once again be using C for our examples. A root position C major chord using a close voicing would be spelled C, E, G, all within one octave. When labeling the root position of a chord, no extra notation is required, so any chord that does not tell us specifically to change the inversion will be in root position. To create the first inversion of this chord while maintaining our close voicing, we would simply move the C up an octave to become the highest voice. This would leave the E, the third of the chord, as the bass note. This is called the first inversion. Again, first inversion chords are defined by having the third as the bass note. There are a couple of different ways to label a chord as an inversion. Which one we use depends on what we are writing and how we are using the notation. Basically, there is the classical way and the modern way. We will talk more about the classical way in a minute, but because it is easier to understand and is much more common in today's music transcriptions, we will use the modern method for now. After the root and value of the chord, a / mark will be added and the bass note of the chord will be written. So, for our first inversion C major chord, spelled E, G, C, the chord symbol would be C/E. This is pronounced C over E. Since E is the bass note or lowest voice, the rest of the chord is above it pitch-wise. So the C chord is over the E bass note. Sometimes this / mark can have another meaning, but a vast majority of the time it is simply telling you that you are to play the chord as an inversion. This is, as I said, the most common way that inversions are notated in modern music. Looking back at our root position C major chord. To create the second inversion, we would move the C and the E each up an octave, leaving the G, the fifth of the chord, as the bass note. This would leave us with G, C, E. This is called the second inversion. Again, a second inversion chord is defined as having the fifth as the bass note. This chord would be labeled C over G, indicating that it is a C major chord with G as the bass note. Let's look at a few more examples. D minor over A. This is a D minor chord, D, F, and A, with A as the bass note. Because A is the fifth of the chord, this is called a D minor in second inversion. From the bass, this chord is spelled A, D, F. G flat augmented over B flat. This is a G flat augmented chord with B flat as the bass note. Since B flat is the third of the chord, it is called a G flat augmented in first inversion. This chord is spelled B flat, D, G flat. F sharp diminished. This is an F sharp diminished chord. Since there is no specific inversion mentioned, it is in root position. This chord is spelled F sharp, A, C. Sometimes the alternate bass note of the chord is not one of the notes of the chord. For example, E flat over F. This is not an inversion of the E flat chord because F is not found anywhere within the E flat major chord. It may very well be spelled as an inversion, but there are a lot of other things that would decide the best way to voice this chord. What we do know about it is that it will contain E flat, G, and B flat, all over an F bass note. I mentioned earlier that there is another way to notate a chord inversion. That is to label the actual intervals that will be used to make up the chord. For this method, we will measure both intervals from the bass note of the chord and mark the size of the intervals to the right of the chord's name. However, this method of labeling inversions is not used in modern notation. It is used in the marking of chord function in harmonic analysis. As you'll see in a minute, it is important not to confuse the two. For a root position chord, the two intervals that make up a triad are the third and a fifth. Looking back at our C major example, in root position it is spelled C, E, G. The first interval from the bass note C to the third E is a third. The second interval from the bass note C to the fifth G is a fifth. The chord is built from the bottom up, so we would add a 3 to indicate the lower or smaller interval, then a 5 above it to indicate the higher or larger interval. It is a C major chord built using a third and a fifth from the bass note. However, because thirds and fifths are the normal way to build these chords, those two intervals are assumed, so we don't have to actually write them. So, if there is nothing written after the chord symbol, it is built using a third and a fifth. Just remember, what we are indicating here are the intervals used to voice the chord. For the first inversion of this chord, spelled E, G, C, the first or smaller interval from the third E to the fifth G is a third, and the second or larger interval from the third E to the root C is a sixth. So we would write a 3 with a 6 above it. Remember though that the 3 as the first interval is assumed, so it doesn't actually need to be written. This leaves the 6, indicating that the higher interval must be a sixth. This tells us to play a C major in first inversion. This chord would be spelled E, G, C. Now, this is not to be confused with the modern chord symbol for what is called a major sixth chord. A major sixth chord is made up of the 1, the 3, the 5, and the 6, and is labeled by adding a 6 after the chord's root. If this type of notation for the inversion were to be used alongside modern chord symbols, these two markings would look identical, making it impossible to know how to interpret it. This is why I separated the classical method of writing inversions from the modern method of chord notation. For the second inversion of this C major chord, spelled G, C, E, the first interval from the fifth G to the root C is a fourth, and the second interval from the fifth G to the third E is a sixth. So we would write a 4 with a 6 above it. Since neither of these are a third or a fifth, they both need to be written. This indicates a C major triad in second inversion, spelled G, C, E. Now, like I said earlier, this method of notating inversions is not used in modern chord notation. But, just for the sake of examples, let's look at our earlier examples and notate them this way. First, we had a D minor over A. This is a second inversion D minor chord, spelled A, D, F. Looking at the notes of this chord, the interval from A to D is a fourth, and the interval from A to F is a sixth. So it would be notated D minor 4, 6. There is no other way to arrange these notes in a close voicing without adhering to this specific interval structure. Then we had G flat augmented over B flat. This chord is spelled B flat, D, G flat. Looking at the intervals found within that voicing, the smaller interval is a third and the larger interval is a sixth. Since the third is assumed, it would be notated G flat augmented 6, indicating that the two intervals must be a third and a sixth. The first inversion of the chord is the only way to accomplish this. Then we had F sharp diminished. This is a root position F sharp diminished chord, spelled F sharp A, C. In root position, the intervals being used are a third and a fifth, neither of which need to be written because they are assumed. So the notation for this chord would actually just be F sharp diminished. Again, and at the risk of sounding entirely too repetitive, this method of indicating inversions is not used with modern chord symbols. Although it is very valuable because it forces us to think more about the actual intervals and the voicing of the chord as opposed to exclusively considering the bass note. As I said earlier, when we learn more about analyzing harmony and chord function, it will be very important to understand this method of notating inversions because it will be used extensively. As always, check the description for a link to some files you can download to help keep up with all of this and the rest of the videos in this series. I hope they help. As I said in the last video, triads are the building blocks of more complicated chords. In our next lesson, we will be looking at some of these more complicated chords called seventh chords. Until then, thanks for watching. If you think I've earned it, hit the like button and subscribe if you want to see more of this series. In the meantime, thanks for watching. I greatly appreciate your time. Take care.